Well, good evening, students, teachers, and the generally curious. Once again, we are the FOPs. We have J. Michael Williams, San Diego. We have David Richmond from Bakersfield, California. And we also have the indubitable, the indomitable, the irrepressible Chris Kavanaugh from Bismarck, North Dakota. I love hardware stores. I really love old hardware stores, the kind that existed before all the big box explosion occurred, those Home Depots that dot our commercial landscape. As a child, I would tag along with Dad to the Cedarville hardware store. Most times I wasn't fully aware at what Dad was actually in search of. But what I do recall was a sense of wonder when I walked in the Cedarville hardware store. That place was magical. Creaking wooden floors, exotic tools neatly displayed on all manner of hook, aisles of endless drawers of nuts, bolts, screws, and washers. Did you know that there are 11 kinds of washers? Astounding, isn't it? Most impressive feature of the place were the old guys who could decipher your needs. You'd walk in and say something like, I need that metal thingy that you use to attach the whatchamacallit to the bottom of the thingamajig next to the doomahitchie next to the furnace in the basement. There'd be a slight pause, followed by, I think I know what you need. Follow me. And thus began the weekly exploration through uncharted worlds of the Cedarville hardware store. Eventually, Skip, and the name was always Skip, no matter what hardware store you were in, he would find the thingy and he would call it, oh yes, here's the 3/8 inch toggle bolt. The value added feature of this excursion was when Skip would also let you know the tools you might need to attach the thingy. Much later in life, I realized I had been recipient of two important things. Number one, I was the recipient of, primarily the recipient of an education, a weekly education in how to do stuff, I guess. Another feature of the Cedarville hardware store is it had everything. Cedarville was a small town of about 1,700. And so it was the store. Somewhere in the mid-1960s, I was given the whopping sum of $5 and instructed to go downtown and do my Christmas shopping at the hardware store. Mom, Dad, Grammy, and Grampy, and my sister all needed gifts. I came home with change. I'm pretty sure Mom, Grammy, and my sister were not particularly impressed with their bottle of Aqua Velva aftershave, but that's beside the point. Fast forward to 2003 when we moved to Waukesha, the Shaw. Olson's Ace Hardware store was my destination on most Saturdays. It featured nearly all the same trappings of the hardware stores of my youth, although it did lack the creaky maple floors. But I must say, when it went out of business, the victim of a big box boom, I actually sat at my dining room table and cried. But fret not, for I have found another hardware store. Old guys and not a few young women still possess the mystical, magical powers of interpreting my semi-intelligible descriptions into reality. Currently, I'm reading a book titled The World Beyond Your Head. It's a wonderful book. It's kind of changed my thinking about, I'd say the epistemology of physical things. And what those physical things tacitly communicate to us. Predictably, it's got me thinking about the philosophical significance of hardware stores. Basically, I've concluded that they are facilitators of human agency. Now, bear with me on this, which might be a struggle at this point. Essentially, These hardware stores provide the materials to repair, modify, or construct stuff in our physical environment. In using these materials, we are both confronted and confirmed. We are confronted in that we come face to face with the reality that human existence features a fair amount of imperfection and defect in need of attention and repair. We are also confirmed in the sense that once we are in possession of all these doodads from the hardware store, we have agency and capacity when we use them to fix stuff. What a wonderful affirmation of human dignity. Well, gentlemen, it's time for this date in history. It's October 9, and I've got three events that all happened on October 9, and I would like you to rank them, not rank them, but tell me in your view which is the most significant. So our three options are: on this day, on October 9, Roger Williams got tossed out of Rhode Island. Also on October 9, Isaac Singer invented the sewing machine. Lastly, on October 9, Hoover Dam began transmitting electricity to the City of Angels. So, gentlemen, what say we? Professor Richmond.
Oh, wow. Huh. Well, since I know nothing about sewing and I don't know, yeah, obviously it's important, but I think I'm going to go with the Hoover Dam. But it's because I think it should be blown up so that we could get rid of Los Angeles there. So I blame, the construction and the completion of the Hoover Dam and the whole water project associated with it, with the creation of this thing called Los Angeles, which is not really a city. It's not a city like Chicago. It's not a city like Milwaukee or New York or even San Francisco. LA is just like God vomited, on the southern coast of California, and it's just everywhere. So I'll choose the Hoover Dam myself.
Well, Professor Williams.
Oh man, well, I actually I think it's probably Williams, but I'm gonna go with Hoover Dam as well because I know I'm hoping that Chris is gonna talk about Williams. But and it's similar to Dave's comment, but I'll add this. Like it seemed the Hoover Dam represents like this uh, manifestation of what I would call early 20th century modernization. And it not only gave birth to Los Angeles, but it gave birth to or helped Phoenix and Las Vegas and a lot of other places where maybe we shouldn't have a lot of urban inhabitants right now, right? Because of the water situation. And it strikes me that the way we approached modernization in the early to mid 20th century, maybe the way we're still doing it is we go for these big projects without thinking about the longer term consequences. And I know in my studies in Africa in the 1950s and 60s, as African countries were getting independence, these were the projects the World Bank wanted to finance the most, the big dam projects, the big industrial projects. And most of them fell flat for a variety of reasons. And we know that today in modern China, there's been much modernization development that has harmed a lot of communities. So to me, it's important because it's the lesson that keeps on giving. Because I think we still are kind of fumbling and making the same mistakes, and I think it's a good reminder that to your point, Tim, and from your introduction, that there's human agency and involved in that. And maybe we should be thinking through these decisions first.
Yeah, there's also human hubris too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Christopher.
I do I have to take Roger Williams now? I mean, Mike, I mean, well, it's
No,
like,
I imagine you're into sewing machines. You can go that way.
no, I'm Mr. Singer, great invention, but he's a distant third to the other two. And I was gonna go Hoover Dam, but let me give my let me go my 2 pennies on the Hoover Dam, and I agree with what you guys are saying. Can we look down the road? But I get a little melancholy, I think, about the Hoover Dam, not for what you guys talked about, but the idea is that we used to be able to do big projects.
Hmm.
We used to as a nation, we used to, and granted, down the road, building in places when we shouldn't build, like Mike said, or as Dave said, God vomited. We got L.A. That's Dave Richmond. Everybody, send your cards and letters to him. But we also did big projects,
Mhm.
and we weren't afraid to take on big projects, and we could do that. If you guys, the boys in the boat, if you guys are familiar with that story, one of those guys on the crew worked on the Hoover Dam, and it's in the book, and it's phenomenal. Just what an accomplishment. Obviously, down the road, there are other things to consider. So I'm a little melancholy when I think that, but I think Roger Williams, and I'm going to throw Ann Hutchison in there too. I don't think it's, we got to put her in there when they get the boot out of Massachusetts Bay Colony and they found Rhode Island. I think it speaks to the idea of religious liberty. So for all the people that want to say we were founded as a Christian nation, I would say this is a good indication that there was about religious liberty, because those folks were not allowed that liberty in that colony. And so they said out, and they said, fine, we're out and we're going to go do our own thing. And we're going to worship as we see fit. Though what was happening in Rhode Island was not all that much different than what was happening in Massachusetts Bay. But I think it's an indication of again, like Hoover Dam, opportunity that in a very young nation, that with that land, and that land came opportunity. Of course, people were already living on that land as well, as we're coming up on Christopher Columbus Day. So,
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I wonder whether, to Dave's point about, the Hoover Dam creates a mess called Los Angeles. I mean, some people would say that Roger, Massachusetts, created a mess called Rhode Island. In our early American history might be the equivalent. I don't know.
Yes.
That's an interesting comparison.
Of course. It might not be apples to apples, but it just
Right.
came
Thank
out.
you, Professor Moore. Welcome all dozens of you tuning in to another nostalgic period addressing what America's Constitution used to stand for before the fascists took over. In this episode, we are going to be looking at the concept of a living versus dead constitutionalism by providing some thoughts and insights into both the amendment process and the power of judicial review. Since we last saw each other, it looks like the Dodgers, the Brewers, and the Cubs are still alive in the Major League Baseball postseason as they battle for a slot in the NLCS. Possibly next time we see you, we'll know which team or which two teams might be heading to that next level. So let's begin our journey exploring this idea of living versus dead constitutionalism with our very own spirit masters who commune with the dead on a daily basis, Professors Chris Kavanaugh and Tim Moore. So Chris, let's start with you. The question that the students are asked references what seems like contradictory phrases. First, Jefferson is opposed to frequent change, but explains that the law must keep up with the progress of the human mind. Help me and the students out by bringing clarity to the seemingly contradictory views. Is he saying that the American mind is slow to progress?
No, and I think that question is worded in a way that's a tad misleading. Most of the students hopefully will understand that Jefferson talked about rewriting the Constitution every 19 years, right? And he had a whole idea about why to do that. And his ideas about debt were very interesting too, and about debt being passed on to generations, which I think is a fascinating thing to take a look at. So I went to find some of Jefferson writing, and oh my goodness, I think that some people today that believe somehow this Constitution, we got these 2 stone tablets and then we got a Constitution, right? And that somehow it's divine intervention. And I'm going to read to you some words from Jefferson I just found very entertaining. It says, some men look at the constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose that they did not be, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it. I labored with it. It deserved well of his country. It was very like the present, but without the experience of the present, and 40 years of experience in government is worth a century of book reading. And this, they would say themselves, were they to rise from the dead. So I am not, he said, I'm certainly not an advocate for frequent untried changes in laws and constitutions. I think moderate imperfections had better be borne with, because once known, we accommodate ourselves to them. So no, he's not, I don't think he's saying that we're slow to progress. I think what he's saying, he's calling people out saying, you know what, we gave you, there's an Article 5 in there. And we need to think about how to use that to keep the Constitution up to date, to reflect society. You know, he says this in another passage, the life belongs to usufruct, the living, that I had to look that word up, and it's to get use out of it. And yet, if you think about where we are today, and I think we may touch on this maybe in another show, the hesitancy to change the document because somehow sanctimonious, right? Sanctimonious reverence that we do with this document, we're afraid to touch it. So I don't think he's saying, David, that we're slow to progress. I think we're saying that perhaps leaders are slow to respond to that progress.
So, you know how I get fixated sometimes on words, the word
No,
frequent.
you?
Yeah,
David, no.
the word frequent. All right. Help me deconstruct, break down this concept, because I'm wondering, we get 10 amendments pretty quickly. Was that too much of was that an example of frequent change, or too much frequency, I guess?
No, I mean, Jefferson had a hand in that. Jefferson had a hand in convincing Madison to write him. So I think he was happy with that, because, I mean, you know, we know that he was wanted a Bill of Rights. So I don't think he was opposed to that at all.
I think to your question about frequent, which is it's a good question, but I think we've said this before, context is king, really. Jefferson's saying this in the middle of a 15-year period where there's a lot of constitution writing, a lot of experimentation. In fact, Pennsylvania goes through two within a couple of years. Massachusetts goes back and forth in attempting to write a constitution. So there have been times in world history where constitution writing explodes. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of just sloshing around. And I think in the American context, it's important that we did that, all that constitution writing, because it's my view that all of those constitutions that were written in the 80s, after declaring, so even a couple of them before we had the National Declaration of Independence, I think all of that comes to bear in the American Constitution. So now, bear in mind, those are all state constitutions. But he's writing in a period where there's a lot of constitution writing. So I think I can't help but think that his use, your question about, how frequent is frequent, it may have something to do with the context in which constitutions are being written a lot, revised a lot, or thrown out a lot. So I think the context might matter in terms of understanding Jefferson here.
Well, let's build a little bit more on the words that he uses, Professor Moore. To the best of your ability, can you provide students and teachers with some insights to how the framers understood the amendment process? Did they view it, as Jefferson did, as a means to allow each generation to put their stamp on the Constitution?
All of them are I would say almost all of them do share this nervousness about, would Article 5 be the Goldilocks solution? Not too frequent, not infrequent. And so I guess I guess that would be my thesis statement, that a lot of them are trying to thread the needle. Now, bear in mind, the articles wasn't amended at all. So there's that experience. And so you contrast that with state constitution writing and amendments, it's quite noticeably different. But I guess I'll answer with stuff they talked about at the convention, as well as the stuff that was floating around the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates in ratification. it's interesting to me that Madison's Virginia plan, this is one of the rare moments where I think Madison is not a nationalist. In the Virginia plan, he proposes an amendment process that does not include the national legislature. It's all coming from the states. And so that's kind of ground zero of how they start the discussion. And it goes through, some modifications. One of the major early modifications was, well, if maybe we should have the national legislature involved. And once the states come up with these amendments, then it's the role of the national legislature to call for a convention. And Madison, at that point, is one of the few in the convention that's he's thinking, okay, if we do that, what are the possible problems? And so he comes up with gee, I don't know if we want to do that, because if we say the national legislature is involved in calling for a convention, what's the process? Too ill-defined. So there's that. Hamilton views states as suspects, so he just wants the national level to be involved in amending. Wilson comes up with the 3/4, like the second phase 3/4 number in the process. Mason was suspicious of the national government derailing state proposals. It's funny to me. I can't help but think that Madison, going back to the Virginia plan, I have to think that his Virginia plan don't have the national legislature propose. I think that's all about the failure of the national legislature proposing amendments during the Articles, because states derailed them all the time. So I think there may be some political ploy in his statement at the convention to not have the national legislature involved based on the national legislature failure of the 70s, or excuse me, of the 80s. During ratification, the anti-federalists, the federalists are like, this is wonderful. This is so much better than the Articles. And it is. I mean, when you look at it on paper, this is much better than the Articles. And so I think 43 and 49, Madison makes the argument. He kind of makes a federalism argument, both state and national involved, which is hilarious because that's not what he wanted in the Virginia plan. He also makes the statement that because the people at the state level and the people through their national legislators, this is a true exercise of popular sovereignty. Now, Federal Farmer and others are like, this don't do this. This will not work. Federal Farmer is a great phrase. It's something like these hoity-toity. All right, I'm gonna get it right here. Artful and adroit aristocrats will obstruct. So the anti-federalists don't buy the argument that it's easy to amend, but that essentially is the Federalist argument. Now, it's interesting to me, one final comment. I think by mid-1788, when states start proposing amendments, Massachusetts, I think in some ways Article 5 becomes maybe becomes the most important feature of the Constitution, because Federalists after Massachusetts and a couple other states propose amendments, they really camp out on Article 5 as relax, we can change it. It'll be easy to change. So I think in some ways, I mean, yeah, they're still talking about the presidency and the Congress and all that, but I think the Article 5 really comes to the fore by late spring, summer of '88, when the Federalists realize they're going to have to make some concessions on these proposed amendments. So I think Article 5 becomes really a lot more important by the summer of '88 than it was pre-88. I'm sorry.
Well, help me out a little bit on this statement, the progress of the human mind. Is Jefferson's view that the American Constitution was a work of progress relative to what came before? And so in that sense, that tone, that Constitution should, or is it that every 20 years that each generation, that the Constitution in which each generation lives under should be a reflection of that generation's values? Is that what he kind of is implying?
Likely, but I don't know I go that far on a limb. Now, I think progress is a key word here. Jefferson's a man of the Enlightenment, and one of the basic tenets of the Enlightenment is progress. And so now think about it. The Constitution is progress. You have checks. You have three branches. Articles, not so much. Articles, unanimity to amend. Constitution, 9 to ratify, and 2/3, 3/4 to amend. I mean, I think there's a National Bill of Rights eventually in the Constitution. So I think the Constitution actually, on paper, is progress, and I think it fits within that immediate narrative of that 15-year period of Constitution making nationally. But it also, I think, is a function of the idea that there's a mechanistic nature to this Constitution, and that's very Enlightenment as well. So I think progress is key here. Now, does it mean that the societal values will change every 20? I have real problems with the notion of progress to begin with, but I think, but I don't know that he would go that far. I think it's more of a scientific experimentation statement of progress rather than of human nature progress.
And just real quickly, you talked about state constitutions, and I look at California and the way we amend. And I'm sure California's got to be an outlier. If we look at some of those early states, and even up to the mid 19th century, most state constitutions, the amending process, reflect more of the national approach, that it's difficult to amend their state constitutions?
Well, you're right. California is an outlier. I mean, Texas, Alabama has like over 700 amendments. I don't know whether well, I do know this. There was this debate at the founding as to whether legislatures could amend. And Massachusetts, again, kind of paves the way here that, wait a minute, maybe a legislature isn't the right entity to do this. Could they self-deal in the new constitution that they might create? So should it go back to the people? In Massachusetts, that meant back to the towns. So this constituent idea versus a legislative entity doing constitution writing comes up very, very quickly in the founding period. But I don't know whether in the 19th century they followed the legislative model of amending versus a constituent model, a convention model of amending. I don't know.
So, Professor Williams, as I understand it, there have been 11,000 amendments proposed from 1789 to 2022. And 27 have been adopted. So keeping that data in mind, how do you read this stat relative to the statement by Jefferson arguing that the law must change with the progress of the human mind? 27 amendments in over 200 years, and go ahead.
It's not a lot. And Tim's comments have made me kind of rethink what I was going to start this off. Like, maybe the framers did not intend for the amendment process to be difficult, but I think the actuality is that it has become difficult in the operation of doing that. And we could think about, is that a function of the United States getting bigger? Is that a function of more states? Is that a function of more diverse interests? But it's hard, and I think based on what Tim was just saying, it was kind of meant to be not easy. Maybe they didn't mean it to be hard, but they didn't want it to be an easy thing to do. They wanted some thought to be with it. And the other thing I'd say before I get to the 11,000 number is that this conversation we're just having made me think through the fact that where the action was in the 1780s and 90s and for maybe the next 70 years was at the state level. So we're looking at it now because the stakes of federal government are so much higher than they were 250 years ago. And the fact that Tim's pointed out that states had a very routine exercise of amending constitutions, I think speaks to the fact of that's where the action was, right? And that's where people were involved. Now, the fact that we've had 11,000 possible amendments and only 27, I think I want to point out to the students, like, how do we understand that number? Because some of these amendments, like, which are the ones we take seriously, right? Because we, you know what I mean? I mean, you could ask yourself, how many actual amendments have passed both houses of Congress with the 2/3 majority? How many are just amendments that are passing, but with a majority vote, only one house? How many are simply just political messages for constituents, right? Like, so a member will stand up in Congress and say, I have an amendment for defense of marriage, for example, right? Knowing that it's never going to get the number of votes to make it happen. So I think that's one way to think about the 11,000, to maybe get it down and think, okay, how many amendments have actually been taken more seriously, and how close have they gotten? I'm thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment, right? I wanted to point out to the students the Corwin Amendment from 1961. Isn't that a great one? It's Senator Corwin, after Lincoln was elected in 1860, before he was inaugurated, as states were succeeding, he wanted an amendment to the Constitution that basically would have said that the federal government would not get involved in any, he didn't say slavery, but would not change slavery on any state where it was at. And it passed Congress. Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, said that he supported it, that if that were to pass, that'd be fine. And they were just trying to find ways to get the states to not succeed. And that was the last amendment that was proposed before the 13th Amendment was proposed and passed. So it's just an interesting way to think about like the different paths of history that could take. At the state level, there have been over 7,000 amendments like passed in state constitutions. That's the number I have. So, and in the last 25 years, those that have been put to the public in a vote, over 60% of those amendments have passed. So it's not like can't pass constitutional amendments at some level, right? We can do it, and we seem to be doing it at the state level. And then other countries, and I'll finish with this. Germany has had its basic law constitution since 1949, so it's been about 76 years. They also require a 2/3 passage in both their lower and upper house. It does not have to go to their federal substructures, but they have passed 60 amendments since 1949. South Africa has passed 18 since 1996. So we'll put this in the show notes. There's a wonderful project called the Constitution Project where you can look at what other countries are doing with their constitutions. And the United States, for better or for worse, is number one with this, that we amend the Constitution less than any other established democracy in the world. So I think the way I put my head around it is that we're missing, and this is the final thing I say, we're missing one of the fundamental norms of the founding era, and that was that we were a country of innovators and tinkerers and constantly trying to, like, as Jefferson says, progress, like not to just think that we have to stay with what we have. I think you see that at the state level throughout our history, and I think that we don't see it at the federal level. And I think I know we're going to talk about it. It's leading to other ways that people are trying to now amend the Constitution without going through Article 5.
Well, I'm wondering if one of the explanations for that, Mike, goes back to kind of what Chris said, and that is this, especially over time, this reverence for the Constitution and this belief by many of its divinely inspired nature that this was touched by the hand of God, and you don't mess with things that were touched by the hand of God. So this evolving reverence for the document and the people who wrote it.
Yeah.
Does that possibly explain why, especially modern generations seem to be so reticent about making the changes?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know the origin story for that, but I do. I mean, I talk to my students. I talk to my students about this as it's a form of ancestor worship, right? And oftentimes when I'm teaching African politics and I'm talking about the belief in ancestors and how that determines daily behavior, and students will laugh and kind of have their stereotypes. Oh, that makes sense for an African to do that. And I think, well, think about the way we house the Constitution in the National Archives. Think about the way that we build monuments, and think about the ways that we have a reverence for the Constitution in a way that doesn't match with what I think the norms were at the time of its passage.
Tim, you want to jump in on origin stories?
Well, yeah, Benjamin Rush sets this up very quickly in Ratification, where he says, about the convention. It's almost as though the hand of God reached down in the convention and helped, and inspired or wrote the Constitution. And all through ratification, Benjamin Rush gets just pilloried by anti-federalists, like, shut up, So the hand of God, if you're outside the soccer world with a Maradona goal in '86, but Benjamin Rush sets up the hand of God, and it was a lively and sometimes funny feature in the ratification debates about whether Rush was, and he kind of was a gadfly too. So that's where we got that idea.
Yeah, Chris?
Something else for the students to think about, going along with the numbers that Dave and Mike were just kind of working through. So you take the Bill of Rights, first 10, and the 27th, which was one of Madison's original proposals. And now we're down to 16. Let's take the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, because they cancel each other out, if I'm remembering correctly. Now we're down to 14. So in a period of the length of our nation, take away the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791, we've ratified 14 amendments to the Constitution. So it's even less. And the other thing to think about too, for the students, the quote that that is in the question was, and I wanted to make sure I checked that, it was from 1816.
Yep.
Right, and the last amendment they had was the 12th Amendment, which was clearing up the mess that they created with who gets what electoral votes. That was in 1804. So 12 years prior to Jefferson's letter that the question is taken from. So and the country is progressing. And back to that question, David, about progress, I'm going to ditto what Tim said. I think it's more about the scientific progress. I mean, as Tim said, Jefferson was a child of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers like Newton were big for him. So he's talking about, I think he's talking about our, that type of scientific progress.
Well, if if the proof is in the pudding, 14 changes in over 200 and years, 200 and whatever years it's been now, seems to be kind of a dim
maybe
statement of the mind of Americans.
maybe Benjamin Rush was right.
So okay, that
I'm trying to keep a straight face when I'm saying that.
Okay, yeah.
Well, and the final thing I'll say is, if you look at the times they were passed, I think there have been 3 periods of where we passed a lot of amendments at once. So I think the students should also have their antenna up about that. There are scholars who talk about there are certain times, because of political culture, economic things, political things going on, that once we start that process, whether it's because of Reconstruction or the Progressive period, we tend to then have a lot of things we want to get off our chest during that period. So that's something to keep in mind.
Well, Professor Kavanaugh, I've been reading and following a scholar by the name of Jill Lepore. Professor Lepore argues in her new book, We the People, that in the 20th and 21st century, a kind of constitutional conservatism has taken over, best expressed by the principle of originalism, a method of interpreting the Constitution that has built-in cultural opposition to constitutional change, i.e. establishing the document as a pseudo-divine document that doesn't need to be changed. Has this reality killed the amendment process? That is, by turning to the court, all right, by the court turning to originalism, and I think well, I don't know, I'm trying to remember which justice, Kagan, didn't she said we're all originalists now? All right, I think she said that a few years ago. Does this judicial philosophy originalism, has it undermined, all right, the amendment process along with other cultural and structural issues?
I don't think it's. I mean, because the concept of originalism is a fairly modern concept, if you will, right? I think go back to Mies, Edwin Mies under Reagan. I think you end up with, this was a group of people looking for a way to affect constitutional change, knowing that the amendment process itself was difficult. So I don't think that the idea of originalism itself is undermining the amendment process. I think the amendment process itself was already, it's not flawed, but it became very, very difficult. So they're in search of a interpretive theory that will allow them to achieve certain ends that they couldn't achieve through the amendment process because the amendment process was so difficult. And I think, and I think Professor Lepore has talked about this. If you think about the work that it takes to shepherd an amendment through the whole process, I mean, I think Mike or somebody just mentioned the ERA, and the work that it takes at the state level. It has to take, you have to have boots on the ground in states to do this. And it takes a lot of work, and especially now that it's a larger nation and a lot of money and a lot of effort to do that. And so I think what you end up with is you end up with political organizations or political thinkers or certain folks that want to be able to change the Constitution, knowing that the amendment process is too difficult. So they're coming up with this concept of originalism, to taking us back to, whenever it makes judges historians, which is a scary thought.
Well, you say that the system's not flawed. To me, it reveals another argument that the framers absolutely misread. In many ways, human nature. I mean, how can they argue? I mean, and we'll turn to Madison about the factionalization of the American nation being so factionalized. All right, if that's the case, all right, how can we therefore have an amendment process that is so numerically challenging? What in their mind was going to lead all of the multiplicity of factions? What was going to lead them to come to a consensus at 2/3 and 3/4 to be able to change the national law? It just seems like they're thinking both sides of their mouth here. Help me out there, Mr. Moore or Mr. Kavanaugh.
Well, you're putting. I think there's an assumption that the founders were really democratic guys. I mean, I'm not willing to put them up on a pedestal. Here's what I mean by that. I think 2/3, 3/4 is a break on democracy. Your question kind of assumes that they wanted democratic change. Well, I'm not willing to go that far.
Well, no, my question is taking from the quote that the kids have to deal with, and that is Jefferson arguing that the Constitution must stay up with the progress of the American mind, yet they've created a structure in which that's not possible.
Well, that might be true, but all I'm saying is I'm not willing to posit small d democracy principles, and therefore let's make it real easy to amend, because that'd be better democracy. I'm not willing to posit that idea. Many of them, frankly, and so I think that's why you get these impossible numbers. And I think Federal Farmer and others, Old Whig has an essay on this as well, that they're not those numbers. It'll never happen. And I think Federal Farmer's right that there'll be a federal government derailing of much of the bottom up efforts to amend. So yeah,
go ahead.
Well,
I'm having some internet issues. Go ahead, Tim.
No, I'm sorry. Tim, were you done?
Yeah, but one other thought. There's a wonderful book by Sanford Levinson. I think he's still down at Texas. The book is called Constitutional Faith, and there's a chapter in there where he makes this very interesting argument that people, like if they're religious and they have a religious text, they tend to, how they interpret their religious text influences how they interpret and how much they interpret and the way they interpret their constitutional text. It's a very interesting theory that kind of ties into your notion, is this a divine document? Well, if you think it's a divine document, you're going to be real reticent to, this comes from the, like in the Christian tradition, the word of God is not something to trifle with. So he makes a very interesting argument that your view of your sacred text influences how you view your secular constitutional text. how many people could interpret. He even says there's a Catholic way to interpret the Constitution and a Protestant way. Catholics, a council of cardinals interprets the Word of God. Well, that'd be the Supreme Court. Protestants, no, priesthood of the believer. I get to interpret. So he has a very interesting argument about the relationship of attitude towards sacred text to secular text.
Chris?
I do agree with you to a point, David, that I do think at times they misread human nature, right? I think that they put too much stock in virtue, that people would be virtuous. And yet we also know that they were politicians. Jefferson was a politician. Madison was, these guys were all politicians. Back to Tim's point, that these guys they're not small d Democrats, right? But I do think they missed that. And I think as our society changed and got bigger, communication changed. Obviously, we're fulfilling that manifest destiny becomes, and people become much more self-interested to get to our boy Tocqueville, right? So I do think they do miss a boat a little bit on human nature. But I mean, I know the Laporte talks about originalism as undermining the amendment process. I think part of it also, as I said, though, is just a way to do an end run around it because the amending process was is today too difficult.
Mike?
Yeah, I agree with what Chris just said, but I was also just thinking that maybe they also misread not just the people, but the virtue of the leaders. Because I think they had faith that they could, the elected officials could be both politicians and they could also be the ones that would rise above and have the civic virtue to look out for the common good. I thought that they kind of felt like they could thread that needle. And what they couldn't envision is that by the 1830s that we have a huge change in like who the people are sending, like who is allowed to participate, right? So that filter is going away. And then it's going to be who are the people that are actually going to run and now get elected, right? Which is going to be different. And so I think there's something, I just wanted to add to Chris's point. I think he's a yes, and I think students should also be thinking about the role of leaders in this. I mean, the leaders have an extra responsibility to, I think, to rise above some of this noise and to actually lead. And I think the framers misread that as well, because I think they misread the relationship between leaders and the mass public, right?
Which sorry, I got to dovetail because I absolutely, and Mike's making a point, which makes me think of, the founding generation were kind of the varsity. And you get these guys that are coming in after them, they're JV, right? They're on the freshman squad.
Not according to Tom Brokaw, the greatest generation, my friend. Your fathers, my fathers, they're the greatest generation.
Not in terms of constitution writing and amending and things and that virtue, right? So when when Jefferson is fading away into the sunset and riding off to begin writing letters with Adams, and these guys are in their final years, and we got some Henry Clays, and we got some other people that are okay, but man, we have some master class of politicians coming up behind him. So that idea of the virtuous founding generation followed by the next generation, not quite there.
And Chris, I really appreciated you kind of breaking down for kids. Let's count how many amendments there really are in some ways that are a voice of the people. And I might even go farther because I know you're aware that there is a group out there, all right, whether they're legit, who says that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are not legitimate because that the Southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment and the 15th with a gun to their head. And maybe the 13th. Did they have to do that with the 13th as well? That with the Reconstruction readmission laws. So maybe it's only 11. Maybe we only have 11.
I've got a response for that, but this is a family program, so.
Is it really? Do you think families actually sit around and listen to the Constitution?
No, but students,
I know my family doesn't.
Students might be, and I don't want to just drop the F-bomb, but hey, screw y'all. You shouldn't,
well, I was at a town hall meeting once and got
F around and find out. Around and find out.
So Professor Moore, continuing my obsession with Professor Lepore, she also argues that the overwhelming number of proposed amendments revealed a restless and unruly spirit of the amendment process. I don't know if I quite understand what she meant there. The numbers overwhelmingly rebuked the Constitution for its ample deficiencies rather than revering its perfection. As you look at the 17 or 27 amendments, however we want to count them, that have been ratified throughout history, what is your take on this perspective? Are they all fixing deficiencies?
Most of them are. Yeah, most of them are looking at structural and process type remedies. As well, and there's an analogy there to the founding period. Like in the ratification, all these amendments were being proposed after Massachusetts Convention. And all in all, there's about 212. And many of them, and I'll put this in the show notes, there's a chart of all the different amendments that were coming out of the states, 212. And almost all of them were structural. There were rights suggestions too, but there's a lot of remedy the system that's at the ratification period. And that continues through our history. I mean, 11,000, I mean, at the state level, there's 70,000 proposals. And to your point earlier, Louisiana, California, Texas, Alabama, South Carolina lead the way in the most amendments. So
oh wait, you actually found a number? Because I thought California just stopped numbering them because we we have so many. It just
yeah. Well, I got that from a wonderful book by Rich Bernstein, one of Chris's friends. Chris was a co-presenter at a conference here a couple of years ago with Bernstein. But I think the restless spirit of America is really seen at the state level. And I also think 11,000 at the federal level is pretty restless too, because most of them do want to remedy structural changes. I mean, I found that there's this chapter in Bernstein's book. It's called Amending America. And it's like this, the Goofy Amendment chapter. I forget what he titled it, but I mean, some of them are just hilarious. There was okay, if we put this into the restless spirit -ometer, how restless is this? There was in 1893, there was a proposed amendment to rename the United States the United States of the Earth. Now, I looked into that a little bit, and it was a little more than just like a goofy hippie proposal, which kind of sounds that way, but it had, abolishing the schools of death of the Navy and Army. It was like this full-fledged utopianism in this proposed amendment. It wasn't just changing the name. There's a lot of other stuff. There was interestingly enough, in 1810, they wanted to beef up the no titles of nobility statement of the Constitution. And there was like, if anybody did this, they would lose their citizenship. There was a child labor proposed amendment in response to Dagenhart. That's another thing, students. Think about how many amendments that we have that are actually overturning a Supreme Court. I mean, Dred Scott in the 14th is the quintessential there. Chisholm and the 11th Amendment is the other. But there, that was an attempt that failed. There was an amendment a proposed amendment outlawing dueling, 1828. There were 60 plus proposal amendments for a national divorce amendment between 1884 and 1929. So a lot of that is not structural tinkering. That's just like social policy tinkering, I think. And so a lot of the restlessness, failed amendments of the restlessness, it seems to me to be much more social than constitutional tinkering.
So am I accurate to say is that the anti-small d that you talk about, the anti-democratic nature of our system,
Yeah.
that when it comes to the amendment process, that's really found in the legislative branch, because most of these amendments don't get out of Congress. I think Chris or Mike mentioned that. Most of these don't make it through, which begs the question, why haven't we had more attempts to use the convention route?
Yeah, well, I think Madison may have been right at the convention. What would the details of that be? Who would be called? Would there be would there be a national standard of who get called? But there's another important thing that I've run across this last week in thinking through this. A lot of the early Congress generally doesn't have a great batting average of proposing out to the states. Most of it comes from states upward. So I think there's a reticence in Congress to continue to stick their neck out on this process because they don't have a great bat. I mean, a few, but generally most of it's from bottom up, rattle hum, not from top down.
I think a great example of that is the 19th Amendment, because you had organizations, suffrage organizations,
Yeah.
women, and they were trying to hammer really away at the national government. But what you start to see is they take their fight to the states. And, you know, Wyoming becomes the first state to actually grant women the right to vote in most elections. And so you start to see that trend, at least for the 19th Amendment, starting at the state, and you see that building momentum before we end up getting the 19th Amendment.
I think this dovetails to Mike's 11,000 statement. I would guess, I don't know for sure, but I think it would be interesting to total up the number of those 11,000 that came from bottom up states versus Congress top down. I suspect there's a lot of failure, a lot more failure and decline from top down.
Well, doesn't that reinforce your notion of the restless spirit of amendment really being found at the state level?
Yes.
And therefore, I mean, again, if you're a political, strategist, and okay, you're working for an amendment, it seems to me if you want an amendment to die, you try to go through Congress first, right? It's like most everything. If you want it to die, you go to Congress.
I was going to say, do we have a Congress? Sorry.
Kind of thing there. So, but help me out. I'm sorry, gentlemen, I'm on a brain fart. But at what they have to go through Congress if they want a convention, right? At what point do they have to go to Congress if they want a convention? In the procedures,
2/3 of states propose, Congress has to call.
They have to call.
Yeah.
And so it's surprising to me that we've never had a convention, because that seems like a surefire way at least to have the national discussion about these issues. Is that we've never been able to get 2/3 of the states,
Well,
to go ahead, Chris.
Well, the Congress.
Sorry, but there was
Go ahead, Chris.
really close with the balanced budget amendment.
Yeah.
And I know that they were promoting that at the state level, and they got a number of states to sign off on that. I don't know where it stands now. I don't think that right now, I mean, it's probably dead in the water, but a few years back, we were close to having enough states to sign off on that to argue about adding a balanced budget amendment. That's the last thing that I can think of that was even close to getting enough states to sign off for the convention. But if you do the math, though, I'm just sorry about this, but back to math, I was told there'd be no math on this quiz. If you think about, I don't know that because right now the way it stands mathematically, because again, the shout out to the states in Article 5, if you do the math, we can amend the Constitution with less than 50% of the people.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I don't know that that's what the framers had intended, but that's one of those structural changes that maybe we probably don't have to worry about in our lifetimes.
Yeah. So, Professor Williams, to my favorite part of this whole question, and that's this living versus dead, and we've already determined that if it goes to Congress, it goes to die here. But Justice Scalia, all right, a favorite of a lot of followers of court history and judicial thinkers and lawyers, good friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there were a number of quips he made over his life that I found rather humorous. And I can imagine he'd be fun at at a bowling alley or something there. But he was the most outspoken justice of the past 50 years to argue that the Constitution is a dead, not living document. If you had the chance to sit down, all right, as a lawyer yourself, you were trained in law. If you had a chance to sit down with Justice Scalia, how would you respond to his declaration of dead constitutionalism?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question. I'm glad I'm the one who gets to sit down with Scalia to talk to him. And I actually did some looking up because I was thinking if we're sitting down, we might want to, eat something. That might be a good way to start the conversation. But
And who doesn't love pasta?
well, he likes pasta with sardines, or he likes pizza with anchovies. So I don't know. Those are two things that I don't know. Or we could go to the opera together, but I don't know if I want to do that either. So
You could go hunting with Vice President Xi.
I could go hunting. I could go hunting with them, yes. So imagine, students, any of those scenarios is where we're having this conversation. Look, in all somewhat seriousness here, yeah, he's one of the brightest minds, I think, to be on the court, right? And I just want to preface that. I think what he saw in his legal career as the problem that needed fixing, I think, is that, in his opinion, the 1950s and 1960s courts were straying from constitutional text and history, and that they were letting their personal political beliefs dictate their decisions without constitutional amendments, right? And this is a separate conversation. And in order to fix that problem, he said, well, we need to see the Constitution as dead, to the extent that the words on the page are words on page. They have meanings. They have meanings that we can trace historically to what they meant, and that judges as umpires should simply find those meanings and then apply those meanings to the new facts. I think that that's my best attempt to sort of argue why he would say public originalism or public meaning is what's going on. The conversation I like to have with him is that, first of all, if history is part of the interpretive process, which I do believe it should be, I don't think we should be blind to history, but why are we being handcuffed by history? And I know Scalia would not care what other countries are doing. He wanted to focus on the United States. But there is no other country in the world whose courts are using history the way that Scalia thought we should use it, or who are saying things like that the Constitution is dead in the way he said it. And I think that it's constructive to recognize that. I think that history, as Chris and Tim have said, is conflicted. There are different ways to understand the words on the page. So that is not like the one out that you have. So I would like to ask him, why is it that judges should adopt either a narrow or a broad understanding of the standard that's in the words? So, for example, equal protection of the laws. Is that just about equal protection of the people at that moment, or are we talking about a broader standard that is going to like move forward throughout history? I think it should be the latter. And if it's the latter, then maybe those words are not, like, we shouldn't see it as dead. We should see it as continually living.
Well, I'm curious, Mike, so you said he kind of focuses on the 50s, 60s, and it seems to me that the case that's always used for living constitutionalism going way out of bounds is Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
But you seem to be saying that his view is it starts earlier. So I'm wondering, is it Brown? Is it Brown versus Board, where he sees the court trying to use their authority for social policy rather than just interpreting the Constitution? Is that the beginning of the problem with the court? I'm just wondering if you know, or can speculate if that's where he starts, this process starts, or is it earlier than Brown or somewhere later? Because it kind of has to be before Roe.
I'm honestly not sure. I do think it is before Roe. I'm honestly not sure, but what I will do is I'll try to find something to put in the show notes on that. So I don't want to speculate. I do think that it's before Roe, and I do think it's this overall sort of feeling of the Warren Court taking constitutional provisions and reading into them, he would say, values and understandings that were not present at the time that those words were written. And that, I think, bothered him in terms of what is to stop judges and justices to reading whatever they want into those words. And I would add that, given, at least for the Supreme Court and federal judges, that it's a lifetime appointment, the stakes are really, really high. It would seem to me if there were a structural change to where justices and judges kind of had a tenure, then maybe we could actually have like a real public debate or some tinkering, right? We try out a certain interpretation for 20 years, and if we find out, no, that's actually doesn't feel right, it doesn't fit with where we are, then we're not stuck with those judges and justices for decades and decades, right? But I think that's what's at stake in these rulings. What's at stake is you got to get it right. So for him, it was easier just to kind of go back to the original ideas.
Tim?
I can't help but think that a part of his gripe and wanting a dead constitution is, to your point about the Warren Court. I think I can't help but think it's a gripe with substantive due process interpretation, expanding the expanding rights that aren't textually there. So I think it's I think it may be a separate issue than originalism. It may be the squishiness of substantive due process interpretation that
Sure.
is his main gripe.
He called it flotsam and jetsam.
Yeah.
As soon as you looked at it, that's how Justice Scalia described
Yep.
substantive due process. And I think originalism, the concept of originalism, is definitely a pushback on the Warren Court, as Michael alluded to. I mean, because that's trying to do that. I think I would ask Justice Scalia. I would ask him to weigh into the Pacificus Helvidius debates between Madison and Hamilton. So these guys are arguing over constitutional interpretation. And so, well, they were there, Justice Scalia. Who's right? You're using originalism. Help me out with this. And see what he has to say on
But
that.
would his retort be, yeah, but they're fighting over actual textual words? That's different than inventing rights, and that might be his response.
No. I'm not going to let you get away with that, because it's the idea we're going to go back and use history and tradition to influence our rulings. So let's go back and use history and tradition with guys arguing over constitutional interpretation and executive power. So who was it, Justice Scalia? Who was right, Madison or Hamilton? They wrote the damn thing, and they're arguing over it. So,
well, wait, I don't know if Scalia's feet are as firmly planted in this historical argument. I think he's much more of a textual arguer than he is a historical argument, as this Roberts Court and the framework they've developed. I don't know if Scalia was necessarily there.
I'm trying to remember the quip. I should have looked it up, but he had a really funny quip, and I agree with Mike. He was a very quick-witted guy. I think he was very inconsistent in his judicial interpretations, but that's just me. A C, Shelby County versus Holder for my case in that. But someone was asking him about Thomas and himself, and he goes, I'm textualist. I'm not like insane or something like that, So he was like an originalist or textualist with limits, and I think he understood those limits.
Mike?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add that there were certain issues like around the First Amendment, around the Fourth Amendment. He often came to conclusions that I guess you would say the liberals really liked because of his expansive or understanding of what was covered by those amendments, right? But he was just making that, like, he was just determining that, like, as his reading. And what I find interesting is we look at other constitutions, specifically we look at something like Germany and South Africa. That's what I looked at for this program. In their constitutions, they have sections where they direct justices and judges on how they should do their interpretation. They don't leave it up to that. So in South Africa, it's like human dignity and the idea that we are in the midst of transformation. That is, you can look at history, but you have to do it through the lens of what's going to advance human dignity and what's going to advance, it's literally transformation. Now, you can argue, okay, how do justices wrestle with that? Well, sure, fair enough. But at least they said something. They're giving some guidelines. It's kind of like we have nothing. We don't have anything of equivalent in our Constitution where we're telling the judicial branch, these are the guardrails through which you should be interpreting the constitutional text. And I just want to point out to students that other constitutions do that, and ours just doesn't, because I don't think that was an idea at the time of the founding of something even to put in.
Gosh,
Well, would it be?
we could just have AI do it.
That's
Well, we're going down that path. It seems rather quickly there. Mike, would it be legitimate to make the point or the argument that the reason that there's a lot of pressure on federal courts, especially appellate courts and Supreme Court, there's a lot of pressure on them to deal with policy issues because the amendment process became so overwhelmingly difficult. I mean, I think about, if we don't have Brown, all right, how long does it take, all right, for us to get the kind of civil rights changes that we experience in our lives if you don't have Brown there? And clearly, I think in some ways Brown is decided because you couldn't rely on a clarification. Yeah, and I don't know where I'm going with this, but does that make sense to you?
No,
it
Okay.
does. No,
because there's an argument to be made that Brown didn't lead, it followed. Roe didn't lead, it followed.
Followed what?
Popular sentiment. Gerald Rosenberg wrote a book that made the argument there was a lot of bottom-up effort on the civil rights movement as well as reproductive rights, and that the court was following. They were following which way the winds were blowing. So there is a counter argument to that, is all I'm saying.
Mike?
yeah, I agree with that, Tim. I guess I would say it seems to me that with each episode we talk about, there's certain things that, like this machinery of government, there was an idea of how it's supposed to work, and we keep talking about, well, this is not quite working right. So then we have to rely upon something else. So I think, to your point, David, I think that if the amendment process were being utilized more often, if we were able to tinker with the system along the way, then the stakes of what the court decides on some of these issues would not be as high. It seems like we keep putting different branches into situations that the system as designed wasn't meant to put them in, right? And now we're reaping the consequences of what happens when people are demanding certain types of changes and they're not getting it through the mechanisms that are there. So now we're relying upon other ways of doing it, because that pressure on the system for those changes or for that clarification or whatever it is, it doesn't go away just because the system isn't working the way it should.
So, gentlemen, we've reached the time in our discussion in which you are asked to provide some final thoughts and insight to Unit 3's question 2 on amendments and dead constitutionalism. So, Professor Kavanaugh?
Well, I was just listening to you guys' last bit and I kept thinking, going back to the Hoover Dam and my comments about the Hoover Dam, when we used to be able to do hard things, and we can't do hard things anymore, it seems like, right? So the idea of amending the Constitution, I don't see it being amended in any of our lifetimes. I don't see it being amended anytime soon, just because the process is difficult and we are difficult. So I'm lamenting that a little bit. And so we've relied on judicial interpretation to change it, right? Or policy changes. And even though we know what, and back to Tim's point about those two arguments about Roe and about Brown, being reflective of what was happening on the ground, and his, Tim's view of bottom up history, which is important. So maybe we get enough bottom up at some point to do that. So I don't know. For the students, understand, make sure you read all of Jefferson's letter that the quote is from. That's where I was quoting from earlier. There's a lot of good information in there as well. Put it in the context of that time period, 1816. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a book by a professor, Jack Balkin from Yale Law School. It's called Living Originalism. He takes Justice Scalia to task in the first 100 pages of the book about certain things. But it's a really good take on interpretation, whether it's a living document or is it a dead document for Justice Scalia. Have an idea about possible amendments you would like to see. I think that's kind of a boilerplate follow-up questions, right? You know, if given the magic wand, what amendments would you like to see added to the Constitution? And don't get stuck on the usual stuff about privacy, because that's always the one we always get, because there's no right to privacy in the Constitution. You can use that, but think about, I would challenge you to think about structural changes. You know, put your anti-federalist hat on and think about the structural changes if you were given the ability to change it. So that's it. Not a lot, not great words of wisdom.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I'm gonna channel my Chris Kavanaugh here. Richard Bernstein's Amending America. It's a really, he writes well. He's a very good writer, and I think it's there's several books out there that are pretty good, but I like Bernstein's. It's very readable, very accessible, so I would recommend picking up that. I also think students pay attention to, I mean, in some ways, this 70,000 at the state level versus 11,000 at the national, I think kind of reveals a laboratory of democracy regarding the amendment process in some ways. The states have been really, there's been a lot of rattle and hum at the state level. So don't lose the federalism piece in this question. And be familiar with your state, how it's been amended. So I think that's important for you to consider as well. What are your states doing? And there's a federalism piece in this, that states have been doing a lot of amending and tinkering.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, yes to both those comments. And I guess I would add, I think as you're working through this question, it might be useful for you to take a look at some other constitutions around the world, whatever constitution fits your fancy. Not because I think you necessarily would use that in a prepared statement or maybe even with the back and forth, but I think it might help your imagination to just think what is possible out there in the political universe. It's the same idea of what Tim just said about thinking about looking at state constitution. It's the same process, but now I'm just saying maybe go outside the United States and look at some other places, because you might see some things or read some things that you had never thought of before, and that might inspire you to think about amendments that you think would be useful for our Constitution.
So appreciate that, gentlemen. I guess all I have to add for students and teachers to think about is kind of looking at the politics over changing. All right. And I firmly do believe that because of the difficulty of the amendment process, that the judiciary became an outlet for change. I also believe that it started partly with Brown, but really has been said here, the Warren Court. And because of just the overwhelming number of decisions that especially upset traditional Americans, more conservative Americans, and this liberal court, the Warren Court, conservatives went to the mat to, to build institutions to work on getting their voice heard on the court. The Federalist Society and a number of other groups out there in which, and they have succeeded. There's no doubt. The Republicans, the conservatives have outplayed the Democrats for the last 40 years on influencing the court and influencing law, all right, by investing dollars and time into the kind of institutions that would make that happen there. But I think the birth of that is because maybe liberals used the court first, and the conservatives said, well, if they're going to do that, we're going to have to come back and do it ourselves. But it all starts with the amendment process doesn't allow us, all right, to ban abortion or ban gay marriage or whatever the issue is, because it's too dang difficult, but the courts can do that for us. So something to think about. In our next session, we're going to be going even deeper into the judiciary and evaluating a statement by the great Chief John Marshall from Unit 4. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye bonds.